All right, good morning, everybody. Great to see you. My name's Patrick Quirk. I'm IRI's Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Impact. Thank you so much for joining us here in person, as well as the hundreds of you online to explore what is at stake for democracy globally in this really monumental year of election. We are particularly grateful to welcome Shannon Green, USAID Assistant Administrator for the DRG Bureau, for being here to share how the agency is approaching these electoral contests and advancing the administration's democracy agenda more broadly. For our run of show, I'll give just a few brief framing remarks and then introduce A.A. Green for her keynote. We'll then move to the panel, followed by Q&A from all of you, as well as those joining online. So to begin, the security of the U.S., our allies, and frankly, humanity's future depends significantly on the state of democracy globally. Yet freedom and democracy have faced significant headwinds over the last 2 decades. The leading indices measuring the state of the democratic world, like those published by the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center, show that authoritarianism surged from the mid-2000s through last year. Dictatorial regimes in China, Russia, Iran, and elsewhere became more oppressive. Backsliding was rampant. But now we're seeing, thankfully, signs that democracy advocates and freedom fighters the world over have started to turn the tide. Despite significant odds, Bernardo Arevalo was inaugurated as president in Guatemala. Elections in Poland ushered in a new governing coalition under Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Similarly, in Zambia, political freedoms have expanded following the electoral defeat of President Edgar Lungu. With these positive developments as a backdrop, we're entering a landmark year for elections worldwide. Nearly 100 countries, comprising more than half the global population, are scheduled to hold electoral contests. Now, as we all know, elections are just one part of democracy. However, the quality and result of these processes will do very much to shape the near-term trajectory of democracy worldwide. This is why, one of the many reasons why electoral integrity is a core area of work here at IRI. In 2023 alone, we sponsored more than 10,000 election observers across 7 countries and reached nearly 20 million people through voter and civic education initiatives in 39 countries. USAID is really at the forefront of U.S. efforts to shore up democracy and thwart actors who might seek to undermine it through a variety of means, but in particular vis-a-vis election support. For all those reasons, I'm really delighted to welcome Shannon Green, who is AID's Assistant Administrator for the DRG Bureau. Previously in the Biden administration, Ms. Green was the Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Task Force. Before joining the administration, she served as Senior Director of Programs at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Director and Senior Fellow of the Human Rights Initiative at CSIS, as well as other senior positions in the U.S. government, including on the National Security Council. Shannon, once again, thank you so much. Over to you. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to IRI for bringing us together for this timely and important discussion. As you flagged, 2024 is really set to be an exceptional year for elections worldwide. It's estimated that more than 60 countries, home to roughly half of the world's population and representing over 50% of global GDP, will hold elections this year. This makes 2024 a make or break year that could either help strengthen democracy movements around the globe or usher in a new wave of democratic backsliding. In a panel discussion with our administrator during the OGP summit, Nobel laureate and embattled journalist Maria Reza said that democracy itself is on the ballot, warning that we will know whether democracy lives or dies by the end of 2024. That might be a bit alarmist, but we do all understand the stakes for the year ahead of us. And we have all seen firsthand the threats to electoral integrity, whether it's manipulation of pre-electoral processes, closing civic space, malign foreign interference, barriers to participation of marginalized groups, or supercharged AI-driven manipulation of information. The challenges that we face in promoting credible elections are daunting. But there are also reasons to be optimistic. The sheer volume of elections gives us an opportunity to turn the tide back towards democracy and to really reinvigorate civic engagement. As IRI's own president said in a recent op ed, the free world should celebrate 2024 as a landmark year for democracy. Liberia's recent elections are a great example of the hope that credible elections can usher in. The 2023 elections in Liberia were the first general elections held without the presence of UN peacekeepers and run by the Liberian government with minimal international support. Voter turnout broke historical records, and after losing by less than 20,000 votes in a hard fought runoff, then incumbent President Weah quickly conceded defeat while emphasizing his commitment to a peaceful transition. I recently met with President Boakai and was really impressed by his commitment to the fight against corruption. And USAID is proud to have supported a robust set of election assistance, anti corruption, information integrity, and conflict prevention programs in the lead up to these elections, many of which were implemented by all of you. So, we must not lose sight of the potential for elections to renew democracy, even as we're clear eyed and prepare for what is going to be a challenging year ahead. With the establishment of USAID's new Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, USAID is well positioned for this moment. In fact, we have been preparing for quite a while. As everyone knows, elections are a cycle and not a single event. For years now, USAID has been putting the building blocks in place, including through the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, to elevate the focus on elections, lead in the international arena, mobilize crucial resources, and confront modern challenges to election integrity. First, we are shaping intra and interagency discussions to ensure that supporting democratic elections and political processes are high on the policy agenda for countries that are going to be facing upcoming elections. Part of that means ironing out the policy differences within our own building and within the interagency long before election day, and also calling attention to problems in the pre-election environment that will inhibit truly free, fair, inclusive, credible, and competitive elections. Second, we are working collectively with other international actors to advance the institutional improvements and reforms that this moment demands. USAID has played a key role in helping form and launch the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity, GENSE, which is the first standing platform promoting coordination and collaboration amongst roughly 30 leading election integrity stakeholders. Later this year, this network will publish election integrity norms documents in two areas. One, safeguarding the independence of election management bodies, and two, supporting genuine and inclusive election reform processes. Third, we are devoting significant resources to addressing critical and long-standing challenges to election integrity. This includes launching the Defending Democratic Elections Fund, DDE. This past year through DDE, we provided nearly $16 million in additional support across 17 countries. And I want to give you a couple of examples of what that looks like in practice. In Niger, DDE funds are helping to build consensus on and implement key electoral reforms to foster competition and participation and to address potential triggers of violence in the lead up to their 2025 elections. In the Kyrgyz Republic, DDE funds are addressing root causes of two deeply entrenched electoral issues: vote buying and abuse of state resources. The funds are also being used to have social and behavior change and advocacy campaigns to raise public awareness of these ills. Fourth, we are laser focused on emerging challenges. To address barriers to women's political participation, USAID is leading the Advancing Women and Girls Civic and Political Leadership Initiative, which is helping to expand the pipeline of women leaders while promoting their safe and meaningful participation in politics and public life. This includes addressing the really salient issue of violence and harassment against women leaders, both online and offline. We're also confronting the growing threat of information manipulation in elections, including by building the capacity of election management bodies to combat information manipulation during the electoral period, strengthening and adapting election monitoring to assess, expose, and discourage information manipulation, supporting independent media and civil society to increase the supply of accurate information about elections, and supporting media literacy to help citizens develop healthy media habits, increase demand for high quality information, particularly in the lead up to elections. Of course, as a development agency, USAID is widely known for our programming. So I want to say a couple words about where the DRG Bureau is quickly mobilizing resources to support several crucial elections taking place in 2024 and beyond. In particular, we've leveraged our Rapid and Flexible Response Fund and Elections and Political Processes Fund. Again, a couple of examples. In advance of Indonesia's February elections, we're supporting independent media and civil society to improve the information environment and encourage inclusive participation. As part of these efforts, our partners are highlighting the concerns of marginalized communities to parties and candidates in addressing barriers to their participation. For Senegal's February elections, we're strengthening the election management body's external communications, training media on how to ensure balanced and fair coverage of the electoral process, and supporting dialogue to diffuse political tensions. And for El Salvador's February elections, we're supporting technological expertise in crypto monitoring and blockchain analysis to build civil society's capacity to track crypto transactions. This could serve as a model for the agency and be applied to our work in other regions. We're also supporting the launch of a regional network of independent journalists to strengthen election-related reporting in an environment in which there is closing space. We recognize that many of you, including our host IRI, are the ones who are implementing many of the programs I just mentioned. It is thanks to your leadership, technical expertise, and longstanding relationships on the ground that these programs are improving the quality of elections around the world. Now, for just a moment, I want to talk a little bit about progress beyond programs, which is the mantra that USAID is applying to so much of our work. As you all know, elections intersect with just about every other subsector within DRG, including sectors outside of DRG. To be truly democratic, elections must take place in an enabling environment that allows for freedom of expression, assembly, and association, as well as transparency, accountability, inclusion, and genuine political competition. That's why we recognize that promoting democratic elections requires a comprehensive approach that goes beyond our electoral assistance. This includes addressing a wide range of democracy issues, such as strengthening civic education, defending civic space, combating corruption, fostering inclusion, promoting media freedom, and bolstering checks and balances. In addition, we are complementing the impact of our funding and programs by engaging in the interagency to better link our electoral assistance with diplomatic engagement. In fact, I just got back from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, and one of the things that we're doing in countries with high stakes elections is making sure we're messaging the importance of those elections taking place in a way that is credible and meets the bar for international standards. Because to truly move the needle, our assistance has to be coupled with diplomacy and a robust set of policy tools to hold bad actors accountable for undermining elections. So I'll wrap up by reemphasizing what an unprecedented opportunity we have in 2024 and how committed we are at USAID to doing all that we can to support credible, democratic elections and to put authoritarians on the defensive. In doing so, we look forward to working with all of you and with the thousands of courageous democracy activists around the world to, as Administrator Power puts it, seize this moment and swing the pendulum of history back towards democratic rule. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Unsurprisingly, USAID and the DRG Bureau under your leadership is well prepared to support the variety of elections that we're going to be talking about in this esteemed panel over the next hour. So let's shift to our regional experts to take a look across the globe as to what they are seeing. First, we'll hear from Dan Negrea, to my immediate left, who is the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Center. Previously, Dan held 2 senior positions at State during the Trump administration as Special Rep for Commercial and Business Affairs, as well as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning staff. To his left, we'll have Will Meeker, who is currently IRI's Senior Director for Africa. Before joining us, Will was Director for Africa at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, as well as head of that organization's DC office. Will served at State in several positions, including, most germane to this discussion, leading the Conflict Bureau's work on elections in Nigeria and Kenya. Then we'll hear from Adam King, who is IRI's Regional Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Prior to joining us 13 years ago, Adam worked at a nonprofit focused on individual and family philanthropy across that region. To my immediate right, we'll then hear from Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez, who is the President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue. Previously, Dr. Chavez served as DAS for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Obama administration's Defense Department and is a tenured professor of political science at the Naval Academy. Finally, we hear from Tess McHenry, who is the executive director of the Middle East Democracy Center. Prior to this role, she served 2 tours at the NSC during the Trump and Biden administrations as Director of Democracy and Human Rights, as well as senior roles at State and USAID, working on all the issues we're going to be talking about today. So let's get right into it. Dan, the center you direct at the Atlantic Council has done some great work examining global trends in freedom and prosperity, including indexes on each topic. But if we zoom in on Europe and Eurasia, some recent elections, like those in Poland, give us hope, perhaps, that democracy is on the upswing. Conversely, the broader region has no shortage of contests that could cut either way over the next 12 months. So in your opinion, over the next year, what are some of the pivotal elections to watch, and what recommendations might you have for the U.S. and broader international community? Over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and I'm honored to be at IRI. Let's start with a definition. First of all, Eurasia. Initially, when I saw it, I said, oh, so all of Asia, right? No. Thankfully, it's not. So it's just the Caucasus and Central Asia, Ukraine. Looking at Europe and Eurasia, it's also helpful to think about the fact that we have there 2 kinds of countries where there are elections, imperfect democracies and non-democracies, and fully functioning democracies like all the countries in Europe. I would also like to dispense with the question, with one of the aspects of Patrick's question, which was, what should the US government do? What would be my suggestions for the US government? I thought Shannon's presentation was excellent. Little to add to that, other than emphasizing the importance of information. I grew up in communist Romania. It was extraordinarily valuable to me to listen to Voice of America, to Radio Liberty. And I'm also one of those who believes that we are in a new Cold War, that we have a new axis of evil that includes Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And that it is very important for the US government, doesn't matter Republicans, Democrats, to represent America's free information to countries behind, on the other side of this confrontation. Okay, so that would be my only recommendation. So now let's go to, so what I would like to do is go very quickly through some countries in Eurasia and then go also quickly through a few individual elections and focus on something absolutely fascinating that is happening in Europe with the European Parliament elections, which, as I start, by the way, I consider Patrick a friend. until I realized the task that he gave me. Yeah, I mean, probably he tried 5, 6 other people who were smart enough to say no. And then he came to me and I initially said, yes, I regret it. But it's sort of like getting like that spoof question, describe the creation of the world in 100 words or less and use pictures. So, okay, so something extraordinarily important is happening in Europe with the shift to the center right and to the right. And the upcoming elections for the European Parliament deserve thoughtful analysis, and I would like to spend more time on that. So let's start with Eurasia. Georgia is a very important election. Georgia and Ukraine were invited by the European Union to join. They are candidate members. Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. The people in Georgia are choosing the European Union and the reforms. The Georgia Dream Party in power is not the most democratic, but there is such a strong support from the people that they may overcome the imperfect conditions under which the election is occurring. Then we have Ukraine, where theoretically they should have an election, except they have martial law. And under the Ukrainian constitution, they cannot have election during martial law. I mean, it stands to reason, because now it's an external event that forced the martial law conditions, but you can imagine conditions where a government will impose martial law and then have elections. The other problem in Ukraine is something between 8 and 15 million out of 40 million people in Ukraine left the country. So you need to poll Ukrainians in the diaspora, which is very hard. So I don't think that they will have elections, despite the fact that Zelensky is being criticized for that, but they won't have elections. Okay. Russia will have an election. There is a saying in Russia, you can't pick your mother, you can't pick your father, and you can't pick your president. So they will have elections. In that poor country, they never had a free election. They had communism from 17 to 92. Then they have a few years with some discombobulated elections, and then Putin came to power in 99 in one capacity or another. So he will be reelected, and yeah, nothing will happen there. Okay. And then we have Turkey. In Turkey, they don't have presidential elections or parliamentary elections, but they have municipal and local election. Now that's still important because Erdogan rose to power starting as mayor of Istanbul. So there are two people, so that the AKK party of Erdogan competes with the CH something party of opposition, and they control Ankara and Istanbul, and he hates that. So let's see if the opposition can survive in Turkey. So moving to Europe, in the UK, the 14 years of conservative rule will most certainly end. Most likely the elections will be in September. They are 20 points behind Labour, so they're going to lose. Mostly because of two issues. One is immigration, and more on that when we talk about Europe in general. There is also an inflation issue, and there is also dissatisfaction with their nationalized health situation. Now, let's talk about a few individual elections in Europe. And let me tell you the terminology that I will use. In reading up on this, I don't like some of the terminology that refers to far-right parties or extreme right or hard right, because then I ask myself, okay, so who is on the extreme left and who is on the hard left and so on. So what I would prefer to use as terminology would be center left and center right and left, okay? So several elections. Portugal is going to have a party from the right, and the same, apologies for that. They're calling from Portugal, by the way. And the same thing in Austria. So that's a switch, a swing to the right. In several countries recently, there were elections. Netherlands, most significantly, Geert Willems is trying to form a government. The Sweden Democrats, Right Party, and the Finn Party, they are central elements of the parties in power there. There is a lot of talk in Poland how the right lost the election. They didn't form a government, but they're the largest party. The same in Spain, where the Socialist Party formed a very interesting, imperfect alliance with a separatist party to form a government. But again, the party of the right is the largest. In Germany, the Central Democratic Union is still the largest party, but the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats are the largest. The second largest is now Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, the right party that has risen from 5, 6, 7, now it is at 20%. In some of the states of East Germany, they are at 30%. They are so large that they cannot form a government even if they try to, according to the state constitutions. The same thing in France, where the France is Rassemblement National, the RN, the Marine Le Pen party. In the latest polls, they're the largest. They poll at the top. Next is a coalition of left parties. So that's what's happening. These are the trends with the rise of the right in Europe on individual elections. And then there is the European Parliament election. So the European Parliament election will be in June. And there are 7 coalitions, groupings there. They don't go by the local parties because there are something like 200 plus parties in all the different countries there. So they form their own groupings there. And what we are noticing there is also a rise of the parties of the right. And I'm going to give a good example to my colleagues, and I want Patrick to invite me again, so I'll stay in my 6 minutes. I won't go into details in this. But let's talk about why this is happening. So it's happening for two reasons: immigration and climate change. So immigration, the discussion here in the United States when people oppose immigration, it's never for the vast majority of the people, for the serious people, for xenophobic reasons. Oh, I don't want more immigrants, because all Americans come from somewhere. Either we or our ancestors came from. That's not the discussion in the United States. The discussion is we want to control how many are coming, and I want to know who they are. In Europe, in addition to these considerations, you have another consideration which is very real, which is cultural. Europe is a blood and soil creation constitute. So people are basically saying the character of my country is changing in ways that I don't like. So they are objecting to that. Even for legal immigration, not to mention illegal immigration, which is a big problem. They are shocked by it, not as much as we are shocked by 8 million people in the last few years. It's not quite as bad there, but it's bad. So this is causing reactions which would have been unthought of a few years ago. For example, in Britain, where the Conservatives is a center-right party. They're not right, they're center-right. They introduced a law, people come illegally, we'll send them to Rwanda. And it went through. It's a safe country. They've passed through several countries before they came here. And there is a belief that people are coming, they're not really in an emergency situation, they are economic migrants. So then you want safety, here is a country. Same thing in Germany and in Austria. They found 3 countries in Africa. They have deals with them. They want to send people there. Same in Italy. They cut a deal with the Albanian government. They created 2 centers there and say, we'll put them there while we process their claims. So in France, they introduced a law to make it more difficult for people who are coming illegally to get status. But this is roiling the political environment, the immigration issue. Okay. The other issue is climate change. In the United States, polls in the United States say 70% of people believe climate change is an important issue. In Europe, it's 90%. Everybody believes it's a huge issue. The problem there is not that something shouldn't be done. The problem is the cost. I found a great quote in a recent article that said, the end of the month is coming sooner than the end of the world. So people are coming there saying, look, you're telling me that there's a catastrophe, that's great. But in the meantime, the cost of dealing with that, I cannot afford it. So in preparation for this report, so I look good for Patrick, otherwise he doesn't invite me again. I did some research for this thing to find data on the disparity between the desire of people to do something about climate change and the cost. So I found a Reuters poll done in the United States where they said 70% of Americans said we should do something about climate change, okay? But only a third of them were prepared to pay something for that. And the amount that they wanted to pay was $100 per year in additional taxes. And then I found a study by McKinsey that says that the cost, global cost of making changes for climate change is $8 trillion per year. So if you, I went to Siri, I said, Siri, please divide 8 trillion by 8 billion, right? Because 8 billion people, that's $1,000. So there is this discrepancy between what people say, I want a third of the people. I want to do something about it. Like $100, but it cost me $1,000. It's a problem. So then what you see in Europe are demonstrations by farmers in Paris as we speak. Go with the trucks so they block Paris. 2 weeks ago, we had farmers in Germany blocking streets, blocking Berlin. Last year, before the election of Geert Wilders, the Dutch BBB party, Farmers Party, cost of gasoline. In France, we had the Gilets jaunes in 2018. They demonstrated for a year, violent demonstrations, cost of, because governments are pushing up the cost of fossil fuels to make them more comparable with the cost of clean energy. And people who are using that don't like it. So that's what's happening. I surpassed the time. So if you don't invite me again, that's whatever.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. A really great job pointing in on some of the key factors that are driving the outcomes of potential outcomes rather of those elections. And like any good friend, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug your new book with Madam Kronig, which outlines a compelling vision for what the foreign policy agenda for the Republican Party should be moving forward. All right, shifting to Africa. Will, democracy across the continent took a hit in 2023, to put it lightly, with a string of coups across the Sahel, several flawed elections, Nigeria amongst them, which arguably did not reflect the will of the people. So in 2024, hopefully they'll give us some good news, perhaps, or at least mixed. What do you see as the most consequential elections, and where should the USG be focusing?
Thanks, Patrick. And as you rightly stated, from Sudan to Niger, it was a really tough year for democracy on the continent of Africa. If you look at the polling data from Afrobarometer and you look at sort of broader support for democracy on the continent, it's still relatively high, although it's been slipping in the past few years with a few notable exceptions, Mali, Burkina Faso, and surprisingly South Africa. But I think more concerning, really, if you look at the broader data, is that support for military interventions in the face of kind of an abusive regime is quite high, 53%. That's a shocking number if you think about that. Now, admittedly, they don't collect data from every country on the continent, but still, the notion that that high of a percentage of the electorate would perhaps support a military intervention if a government is abusive is really quite startling. And youth are really overrepresented in that. And so when we think about what to do in the broader sort of election space, the broader democracy and governance space, we really need to be thinking about the role of youth. Now, I won't have time to go through every election that's taking place in Africa this year. There are, depending on who you ask, going to be 19, maybe there's going to be 18, we'll see. But a lot, right? And as you think about those, there's many important ones and many that we could discuss today. But I kind of wanted to spend time kind of thinking about two buckets. One is sort of the slightly more consolidated democracy bucket. Won't spend a lot of time on defining terminology here, but just stick with me. First is Ghana. And Ghana is a darling of the US and has been for a very long time, of course. This is going to be their 9th election since transitioning from military rule. They're implementing some really important electoral reforms coming out of 2020, including sort of putting in place biometric voter registration, perhaps improved ID cards, things of this nature, on the positive side. On the negative side, the ruling National Patriotic Party has perhaps, I say perhaps because there's only one data point here, taken some steps to close down civic space for the opposition, the NDC. We'll have to watch this. There's only been one, as I mentioned. And there are some concerns, although need to be balanced against the positivity of some reforms, that a decision to use the so-called Ghana card, this new card that one must be issued to sort of verify that you're somebody who can vote in an election, may disenfranchise particularly rural populations, and those rural populations tend to support the opposition. And so we'll have to watch this space a little bit. Jumping over to, or rather south, all the way south, to South Africa. Again, this is an election where the US government hasn't focused on overtly as much. I think there are, on one hand, some reasons to be concerned. On the other hand, some positive notes. So on the concerning side, voter turnout and voter turnout has dropped a lot. Voter apathy has gone up in South Africa over the years. If you look at the first election post apartheid to today, it's about a 20% drop turnout. That's significant. Again, overrepresented by youth. And so when we think about that, it's quite a big challenge for South Africa. But there perhaps is a little bit of good news in terms of the multi-party competition. The ANC is very likely not going to take the majority for the first time ever. So this opens up space for competition for opposition parties, which on balance is a good thing. But there are concerns with the apathy element coupled with perhaps what the ANC may be willing to do to retain power, that suggests that there may be some instability running up to the election, right? And as all of you are aware that watch South Africa closely, there's this really concerning trend in terms of xenophobia. And the way in which this could be instrumentalized politically around the election, I think is legitimate cause for concern. And so shifting over to what I would say are more conflict-affected elections that are taking place this year, I just want to mention that it's the few that are holding elections this year are critically important because of the trends in particular of what happened in 2023, frankly, what happened in 2022 and 2021. Those moments are potential inflection points. Positive things can come out of them, or it could be, as Shannon mentioned, further backsliding across the continent. So the first is Chad. For those of you that watch the region, for us to be sort of discussing Chad as a potential bright spot in Sahel, it is perhaps a tad ironic, but I don't want to take too much away from the great moves the Chadians have made over the last few years. The military transition, which I think we can all agree was a little bit challenging, did result in a constitutional referendum at the end of last year. And Chadians said, okay, we're going to implement a new constitution. It paved the way for elections in the upcoming year. There's also been some really interesting developments on the political landscape where the lead opposition figure, Success Mara, has now been integrated into the Deby administration as prime minister. It's too early to say, I think, what that will mean for true political contest in Chad, but it is an important development. But I think for everybody who's watching the continent these days, there's a lot of concern about Sudan, and the dynamics there greatly affect Chad. And because the Deby administration has gone in hard in terms of support to the RSF in Sudan and supporting the Emiratis to come in to arm the RSF, that is not wildly popular among particularly his own ethnic elite in Chad. So there's this interethnic tensions and potential flashpoints that we need to be concerned about. There were rumors earlier in the year, well, actually last year now, about a potential palace coup in Chad. I don't think we can take that off the table, but at least for now, it seems like things are trending in the right direction. And the other election on the continent to touch on a little bit is Mozambique. And Mozambique's been out of the news a little bit since the violence and the sort of insurgency have, at least in terms of overall casualty count, have waned. But that doesn't mean that the underlying grievances that gave rise to it in the first instance have been addressed. Political exclusion, economic exclusion, both critically important to northern Mozambique. And for those of you that were watching the local elections last October, it did not go well. There was quite a bit of violence when there were opposition protests. There was significant cracking down by the police. And just to give you a one data point, the ruling Frelimo party won 64 out of 65 municipal seats, including in opposition strongholds. And so clearly on the face of it, it strains credulity. And so I don't think we can say they're likely to be legitimate, but nonetheless, I think this is a question about what can be done to improve even moderately this sort of outcome of this process. Which brings me to what the U.S. can do. And I was really glad to hear Shannon mention early on about the sort of bringing together of diplomatic engagement with programming, because that's so very critical. And under excuse me, Secretary Blinken's trip to West Africa and Southern Africa of late were a positive step in the right direction in terms of the White House engagement on the continent. We would submit that it'd be really critical for the U.S. to show up at one of these elections at a very high level in the coming year. There may well be plans, but none that I've heard of as of yet. And I think that could send a strong signal that A, the U.S. still cares, but B, the U.S. is also watching and perhaps supportive in certain respects. And if there's an election that moves particularly smoothly, sending a high-level representative out there to sort of underscore that the U.S. is behind these sort of peaceful and inclusive transition processes would be really important. Similarly, in that vein, at least to my knowledge and our team's knowledge here at IRI, there are no international observation missions scheduled in sub-Saharan Africa this year, despite quite a few high-level elections, including some of those I mentioned today. Again, shining a spotlight, but also sort of trying to support processes that go particularly well is really important. On the side of election integrity, and I know Shannon and Patrick and others have mentioned this, wanted to mention a few separate things. One is on voter and civic education, the need to continue to support this, particularly with youth. And if you recall, as I was mentioning earlier, the apathy among youth is getting quite high. So them as a sub-target group. On mis and disinformation, really critical. This is not anything new on the continent for those of you that have been tracking elections in Africa, but it's sort of reached this really, really dangerous critical point perhaps. And I think Shannon mentioned, and I was really happy to hear that this notion of sort of getting civil society more engaged and media, local media more engaged to sort of fact check and provide other avenues of information is really, really important. And political party support. And I mention this principally because if you think about what's driving this apathy and the support for other types of regimes in sub-Saharan Africa, you have to, it comes back to whether or not the governments are being responsive to the people. And so having a more competitive landscape, which ideally would be representative of many different parties contesting for the election, would better bring responses to people. So it's really important. And then lastly, I know we're not talking about 2025, but just to put a plug out there for two elections. One is Uganda, which is really, really concerning in terms of the closing of civic space. It's difficult to think through what precisely could be done at this point, but it is really critical to continue to make investments. And the second is Tanzania. There's local elections later this year, a lot of electoral reforms, and there's a little bit of hope in this administration in Tanzania that that are worth watching and worth investing in for next year. So for the other 13, 14 elections, I will I'll remain mum for the time being. Thanks a lot, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Will, for that overview. And as Assistant Administrator Green mentioned, elections are not a moment in time, but a cycle. Never too early to start thinking about 2025. So good to plug Tanzania and Uganda. We're shifting to Asia Pacific. Adam, well over 1 billion registered voters are going to go to the polls in your region this year. Most recently, the people of Taiwan voted in resounding favor of democracy and against further encroachment by China. So as you look ahead, what, in your view, are the pivotal elections we should be focused on and why?
Thanks, Patrick. So we heard some discussion about the number of people who are going to be voting in 2024. And much of that number can be attributed to the Asia Pacific. So 4 of the 5 most populous countries in the world will vote in 2024. And of those 4, 3 of them are in the Asia Pacific: India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. Those 3 alone are almost a quarter of the world's population. So Asia, when we're talking elections 2024, we're talking Asia. There are many important countries that are holding elections this year that I won't touch on now because I can't cover them all, as Will couldn't either. I'm not going to touch on Bangladesh or Taiwan or South Korea or even the world's largest democracy, India, Sri Lanka, Maldives. There's many others. But I want to focus on 3 countries that I think are very, very important, but I think they often get overlooked, especially by the media. And so I think they're just kind of often not paid that much attention to. So the first one is Indonesia. The stats are pretty incredible when you hear them. It's the world's 3rd largest democracy, the largest Muslim majority democracy, and 2nd largest in terms of potential registered voters. They have about 204 million registered voters, potential registered voters, half of which are under 40. So it's also a country of great youth. There's a good chance there's going to be 3 times voters will go to polls this year. The first time, the presidential and legislature elections, which will be on February 14th. There will probably most likely be a presidential runoff in June, and then there'll be local elections in November. We need to keep in mind that Indonesia's democracy is still very young. It's only 25 years old, and they're only electing their president for the 5th time. We've seen democratic backsliding in Indonesia over the last 5 years. The Anti-Corruption Commission has been politicized. Opposition leaders have been investigated. Controversial court decisions are paving the way for elites to run for office. Weakening of campaign finance disclosures, a concerning front runner, among many, many other concerns. So that's kind of the overview. The one thing that IRI is doing is we have been working with lots of candidates and campaigns to prepare for the election. So I'll if there's questions, we can get that later, but I'm going to move on to the next country, which is Pakistan. So Pakistan has a general election on February 8th, and this is following a 3-month delay. I don't know if you've been following, but there's been quite a lot of drama in Pakistani politics over the last few months, well, even going back beyond that. So the elections will occur amid a severe economic crisis and a lot of ongoing political instability. As the political landscape has been shaped, there's basically a power struggle between the military, who is usually seen as like the power behind the scenes, and the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. So he was ousted with a no confidence vote some time ago. There's a lot of kind of to go through. He was attacked and shot. He's got protests behind him for a long time. But the result right now is that he's in jail awaiting trial with nearly 200 cases filed against him. But he and his party remain quite popular. So it's a difficult situation where Khan is probably no angel, yet there's going to be a lot of people who are effectively disenfranchised because the person that they would like to vote for is unable to run. Therefore, the prospect of a free and fair election is unlikely because we have the military exerting significant influence. Another former prime minister, Nawaz Sharif, who was ousted in 2017 following a corruption probe, now appears to be the military's anointed candidate. This is because this Pakistani Supreme Court lifted a lifetime ban that they had placed upon him to contest the elections for people with criminal convictions, while it upheld the Electoral Commission ban on Imran Khan's party from using its electoral symbol. So if you know anything about Pakistani politics, when you vote for a symbol. And so Imran Khan's party cannot use their symbol, which is basically how you know the party, which will make it very difficult for people to vote for them. In addition, many of the party's leaders have been jailed, their electoral candidates' nomination papers have been denied, and their online rallies and fundraisers have been blocked. So I'm not painting a good picture of how Pakistani's election is going to go, but we will have to wait and see how things are. The other country I want to talk about right now is Mongolia. So here at IRI, we talk about Mongolia as a true island of democracy. It is completely surrounded by maybe the two most powerful authoritarian actors there are, China and Russia. But it's been an incredible democratic success story for over 30 years. But it's also a young democracy and has a lot of serious problems. First, it has, in effect, had a one-party state for 5 years or arguably longer, depending on how you want to define it, mainly due to the disarray of the opposition, who is now working to pull themselves together. It's more complicated than that, but if the opposition could be a little more unified, they probably wouldn't have the one-party state situation. So in June, we're going to have a parliamentary election, which will see the legislature, which is called the State Great Khural, and it will expand from 76 seats as is currently to 126. And in that 126, some proportion of that will be proportionately elected, where before they were all directly elected. So how was this a one-party state? Well, in the last election, the Mongolian People's Party, the ruling party, the MPP, received 62 out of 76 seats. They had a super majority, yet they only won 45% of the vote. So we expect the MPP to win this next election again. However, we don't expect a super majority, helped along by the opposition DP's a little bit better organization, but then also because of those proportionate seats, which will help the DP as well. So after 8 years of an MPP supermajority in parliament, that is the former Communist Party who ruled Mongolia before they turned to democracy. The democracy remained. The MPP was able to, well, they successfully maintained democracy. But as we like to say, there's a lot of warning lights flashing right now in Mongolia that are really concerning. And I won't go into all of them, but it's things such as potential draft laws that were quite undemocratic that nearly, well, sometimes were passed. One was passed that was vetoed by the president. Others did not quite get passed. Detention of journalists, a lot of things like that are really warning lights flashing. And so what our hope is that if this election brings a little more plurality to the government, that we will have a little bit more solid footing for Mongolian government, but we'll actually have to wait and see how that goes. And I'll just mention that prior to the election, we have been working with the three main political parties. That's the DP, the MPP, and there's also a smaller party in the parliament called the Hun, just to work on their messaging and their candidate selection, the kind of nuts and bolts things that you do with political parties prior to elections to make sure they're ready to go. I think I'm going to stop there. Those are the three elections I wanted to highlight, but I can take questions and others if necessary.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. Okay, shifting to Latin America, Dr. Bill Chavez. We're meeting here today just a few weeks after Bernardo Arevalo was sworn into office to be Guatemala's new president, marking what many, and myself included, view as a real win for democracy. But this positive is balanced against what some might call turmoil in Ecuador, Venezuela, and elsewhere. So in your expert opinion, as we look ahead for the next year, what do you see as the most consequential elections, and where should the U.S. and the broader international community be focused?
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. I want to thank IRI for the invitation, and it's a particular honor because you have such deep expertise in-house here with Tony, who directs the Latin America and the Caribbean team. So it's wonderful to be here. So I'm glad you mentioned Arevalo, because Bernardo Arevalo was elected last year in August. And I have to say that the US and IRI played a huge role in especially election monitoring and setting up those elections, because between August and when he was supposed to be sworn in January 14th, there was basically, I think he's right in calling it sort of a slow motion coup attempt to prevent him from actually assuming the presidency. And so it is a bright spot, but I don't think we should be overly optimistic. We need to be really careful. And I think Guatemala, although it's not officially an election this year, it needs to be one where the US and the international community continues to pay a lot of attention. Tony and I were actually at the inauguration, and we had the pleasure of waiting 10 hours for the inauguration. Actually happened after midnight because the Pact of the Corrupt, what they're called in Guatemala, which is a combination of certain members of the private sector, but also the members of Congress, did everything they could to stop him from assuming the presidency. And it's not like they're just going to stop trying to make problems for him. So we need to continue to keep an eye on Guatemala. And Guatemala, I know it doesn't have the population. It's a small country. Size matters, but it's not the only thing. Guatemala, of course, is a small country in Central America, but it's in a very problematic neighborhood, especially when you look at the US. One of our major concerns, and we're seeing it in this migration is so highly politicized right now. Part of the strategy to address migration is, to go after the root causes. And we now have a good partner with Arevalo, whereas I would say with El Salvador and with Castro and Honduras, not so much. So I think we need to do everything we can to help Arevalo succeed. And I will say also that civil society in Guatemala, along with the international community, played a huge role in ensuring that the transition occurred. And so all of the work that you do with defending civic space, bolstering civil society, it's incredibly important. And we saw that firsthand in Guatemala. So Shannon mentioned that this is a make or break year for democracy, and it certainly is in Latin America. And I'm going to focus primarily on two. There are 5 elections in Latin America this year, and there is supposed to be one in Venezuela by the end of the year. I'm going to focus primarily on Mexico and El Salvador, and just briefly mention what's happening in Venezuela. But as we're hearing from our colleagues who are looking to other regions, this gradual deterioration of democratic norms, rules, and institutions has definitely been a concern in Latin America. In the past, in Latin America, of course, the threat was more what you were describing, a military coup. But now it's elected leaders that come to power and then systematically dismantle checks and balances. And that's happening in Mexico. It's happening in El Salvador. And as we know, it's basically been completed in Venezuela. So, and another trend I want us to keep in mind that's going to be a big issue this year in elections is this issue of crime and violence and citizen insecurity. You mentioned Ecuador, but what we're seeing is that this is a #1 concern across much of the region. Latin America and the Caribbean have consistently had the world's highest homicide rate, but they also have the highest proportion of homicides involving organized crime worldwide. And that's why I think your point about Ecuador is really important. So Mexico. So the Mexican elections are going to take place on June 2nd. I think we're almost certain we're going to have a woman president. We'll see a woman president in Mexico. And the principal contenders are Claudia Sheinbaum of the Morena Party, which is the party of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, otherwise known as AMLO. And she's definitely a protege of AMLO. She's considered to be very close to him. And then her principal opponent is Xochitl Galvez, who leads an opposition coalition. Right now, as of yesterday, Sheinbaum is 48%, polling at 48%, a 16-point lead over Xochitl. But the U.S. should really care about this election. I mean, migration, obviously, the economic ties, of course. In 2023, Mexico surpassed China to be the largest trading partner of the U.S., but also democracy. AMLO has not been good for liberal democracy in Mexico. He has, I think, of great interest to this audience in particular. He's gone after the Independent Electoral Authority, which really was a model for the region. He's gone after the judiciary. And right now, the judiciary is kind of like one of the last things standing in the way of kind of I would say, a very rapid slide. It's already a hybrid regime, but towards authoritarianism. last year, the Vanderbilt's Latin American Public Opinion poll reported that 73% of Mexicans feel that there's little freedom of expression in the country. And so the $1 million question right now is, if Sheinbaum were to win in Mexico, is she going to continue along the same path as AMLO? And there's a lot of debate on this. Sheinbaum is mayor of Mexico City. In that position, she actually really bolstered the police when it comes to going after citizen insecurity. She's a scientist, she's a PhD, but there is a lot of concern that because AMLO is one of these guys who I don't think is going to go quietly into the night. I think he's going to continue to do everything he can do to exert influence. And another issue that she's going to really face, and Xochitl has said that she's going to reverse this, which is going to be difficult, is this issue of militarization in Mexico, which has, of course, implications for democracy. And I think Mexico is very emblematic, and it serves as a cautionary tale, because there's growing demand for sort of the Bukele, mano dura, iron fist policies and militarization, even in countries like Chile. But in Mexico, the process got started in 2006, and it was meant to be a short-term quick fix to the very real challenge of citizen insecurity. Here we are, almost 20 years later, homicide rates, crime continue to rise. And the militarization, and AMLO, very interestingly, one of his campaign pledges was to bring the military back to the barracks. But what we've seen him do is just really double down on the military in a way that it was never happened before. So now not only is the military basically replaced the civilian police force, but it's also has given an unprecedented role in the politics of the country and the economy, including a major stake in lucrative infrastructure projects and control over the operation of airports, seaports, and customs. So this is going to be a really difficult thing to roll back for either woman. El Salvador was mentioned. The election is this Sunday. And I think El Salvador, since we're talking about Mexico and El Salvador, I think it's in Latin America and the Caribbean, I would say the important distinction is not really right versus left. It's like, where are you on the democracy continuum and where are you taking it? And so here we have Nayib Bukele, who also very systematically, we were talking earlier about the authoritarian playbook, which I think we all see in our regions, very systematically dismantle checks and balances. The judiciary, as in Guatemala, was one of the first things, independent judiciary is one of the first things to go. In El Salvador, only 11% report that there's freedom of expression. So 89% report that there's very little freedom of expression. And in fact, he's constitutionally barred from running from re-election, but he's likely to win by a landslide on Sunday. He has sky-high approval ratings. Polls predict that he'll win with around 70% of the vote, in large part because of his policies, his anti-crime policies, his anti-gang policies, which have led to a significant reduction in gang violence and homicide rates. So what we see in El Salvador is this willingness to sacrifice elements of the rule of law, of democracy, in exchange for security. And this is a trend I think we should be looking out for when we're looking at the rest of the region. In March 2022, Bukele declared the first state of emergency in El Salvador. It's been extended ever since then. So still living under a state of emergency. It's still in force. Measures, really extreme measures, including collective trials, really long pretrial or just like unmonitored pretrial detention, the imprisonment of children as young as 12 years old. And Amnesty International report from last month said, highlighted the systematic use of torture and other mistreatment of prisoners. And he has jailed over 74,000 Salvadorans. So I think we can expect that after this election, Bukele will move to further try to concentrate power. So that's a very, very worrying sign. Very briefly on Venezuela, because I think it's been in the paper a lot. So things don't look good. So, I mean, things don't look good. The Maduro regime and the opposition agreed in October of last year to hold presidential elections by the end of this year. And part of that was to allow election observers, to allow the opposition to really put forth their candidates. But just last week, late last week, the very pliant Venezuelan Supreme Court upheld the decision to bar Maria Corina Machado from holding office. And this is troubling. I mean, excuse me, Maria Corina won with 90% of the vote in the primaries, and now she's barred from running for office. This has been widely condemned. The OAS put forward a statement saying that this eliminates any possibility of a free election this year. So Venezuela is not looking so good. I will say, though, we're out of time, but I will say Uruguay is looking good. Frente Amplio, it's versus the National Party. It's kind of more, I'd say, more consolidated. Uruguay, we always Latin Americanists love to point to Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, but Uruguay is still performing well. Dominican Republic and Panama also have elections.
Always good to end on a positive note. Before I go to Tess and ask all of you, after Tessa's remarks, we'll go out to the audience and those online for Q&A. So start to think about questions you want to ask to this august group. All right, Tess, first of all, congratulations on the recent merger of POMED with the Freedom Initiative to create the Middle East Democracy Center. So kudos to you. Your region, unfortunately, is beset by a series of crises, to include what, by any definition now, is a true regional conflict. So in 2024, as you look across the horizon, which elections pose an opportunity to perhaps reverse some democratic decline, and where should we be worried about?
Thanks, Patrick. It's wonderful to be with so many esteemed colleagues and many people in the audience I consider friends, which makes it even harder for me to say as the last presenter, after we've all been depressed enough, is I'm going to drop some even worse news on all of you, much of it existential. 2024 elections in the Middle East and North Africa, so MENA, are more than likely to either cement authoritarian rule or do nothing to arrest the widespread backsliding. So the elections scheduled to take place this year are Iran, Algeria, and Tunisia. And before I get started talking about those elections, you all know this is coming. What's overshadowing all of geopolitics, all of democracy, all of systems of governance, peace and stability in the MENA is what's going on, as Patrick mentioned. So the Hamas terrorist attack that killed 1,200 Israelis, took more than 240 hostage. And then in response, Israel's ongoing military campaign that has killed more than 25,000 Palestinians. At this point, based on what you're reading in the news on Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, this is becoming regionalized. At this point, it seems pretty inevitable. So what does this mean for us as democracy supporters and defenders? It's very difficult for me to say this and admit this, but the US's public and evident support for the ongoing Israeli military campaign in Gaza has directly affected the willingness of democracy defenders and advocates in the region to work with the United States, to publicly affiliate themselves, and to ask for support and to take that support. We've heard from a lot of organizations and advocates in the region in many important countries over the years, such as Egypt, Tunisia, elsewhere, that they simply can't take the risk of affiliating themselves. That should be very, very serious to those of us in the international community who want to support pro-democracy advocates. So as we discuss elections in 2024, what the United States and other donors are looking at is working to rebuild their own credibility on democracy and human rights in the region and directly with advocates. And spoiler alert, not just advocates in the MENA region, but advocates in other regions who absolutely apply what is going on in Gaza to themselves, consequences for their work and their affiliation with the United States. So we're certain that 2024 is not looking good for MENA elections. I like the fact that Adam, for example, was like, it's all about Asia, proportionally speaking. Well, it's definitely not all about MENA. So talking about proportions, I mentioned the 3 elections, Algeria and Iran. Let's just get those out of the way in 2 seconds. Nothing's going to happen. We're not going to see democracy in one way or another, further autocratization or doubling down, total inability to let any form of opposition to participate in democracy or their own citizens. So we can cover that in about 5 seconds. What I want to focus on then is Tunisia, right? Tunisia, since the 2021 coup, President Said has positioned himself as this populist who will stand up to the West. So first, not a great entry point for the United States and others. Tunisia was this bright light of the Arab Spring, basically the last one left that was pushing back against democratic backsliding and charting its own course. And over the last 2 years, essentially this trend has been reversed. So among other things, Said has used his anti-corruption push, the thing that a lot of us care about, the United States cares about through its anti-corruption agenda, weaponized its anti-corruption agenda to, in fact, imprison journalists, imprison its opposition, and essentially shrink the space for dissent and actual rule of law. A lot of Tunisians remain disenchanted with politics, the economy, all of it. So there was extraordinarily low turnout in the Tunisian local elections last December. Only 11.6% of people showed up. This is very similar to the turnout we saw for the parliamentary elections a year prior and the constitutional referendum, raising the question that I think a lot of us have in all of our regions is how legitimate is power and how legitimate are decisions when barely any of the population is participating. So despite all this, Said retains generally broad favorability despite dissatisfaction with the economy and job creation. Tunisians have not yet assigned their full blame onto him for the difficult economic situation or his failure to solve it by declaring that a coup was necessary to solve it. So we're sort of at this impasse of general disenchantment and just disengagement from politics and civil society from Tunisians in general. On top of this, there are trends you saw talked about in many of the other regions discussed today. Said scapegoating the poor state of the economy on Black migrants, on the old ruling party, and even his own cabinet ministers, which is a pretty novel approach. This tactic is working for him so far, but it remains to be seen how sustainable this is as the economy keeps plummeting and as Tunisians really face very serious questions about survival. So I promised you a really depressing readout. There it is. So what can the United States do about it, which is Patrick's big question. Specific to Tunisia, U.S. support should be oriented about preserving space for civil society and pro-democracy activists to survive, to organize. We're not talking about sort of combating backsliding at this point. We're not talking about democratic renewal at all. We're talking about preserving desperately that space for people to talk. So the U.S. can continue to work on its priority of countering digital misinformation, but specifically in the Middle East and Tunisia. It can continue working on trying to cut funding to those Tunisian ministries that are engaged in human rights abuses and vast corruption and repression. The U.S. should keep pressing the Tunisian government to release political prisoners, which are increasingly members of the media, which, as many people have mentioned here, is really part of the authoritarian's playbook. The U.S. should also use its foreign assistance to fund Tunisian experts, activists, and civil society to convene amongst themselves, even for private dialogue, to discuss what the future of Tunisia is, that sort of integrated piece, the political future, the democratic future, the economic future. And so some of the things that Shannon mentioned earlier, these global initiatives on journalists or women's empowerment should include Tunisia and arguably the Middle East, which gets to my last point, which is the very last region you ever think of or never think of for the Summit for Democracy, for the Presidential Initiative on Democratic Renewal, for any priorities on democracy is what? It's the Middle East. We call this the Middle East exemption. So we can't really have a only country-based approach to democratic renewal in the Middle East. Not one corner of the Middle East has been isolated or untouched from the war in Gaza. So that issue set will also need to be addressed and not ignored. So at this point, it's never been more clear that the Biden administration or any administration in the future needs to reconceptualize how the MENA region fits into this discussion of democratic renewal and countering authoritarianism across the globe. We all know the great quotes. President Biden said that renewing democracy is the defining challenge of our time. So with U.S. credibility on democracy and human rights low in the Middle East, and arguably because of that across the globe. We have to remove the Middle East exemption, and we have to make sustainable progress on fighting authoritarianism, even if it's with some of our friends.
All right. Thank you, Tess. And thanks so much to the five of you for walking us across the globe and highlighting some bright spots to think about, as well as some dark corners. But even there, noting that there are things that can be done to retain civic space. Shannon, if you can come up to the table for the Q&A portion. So for those of you here in the room, I would ask that you queue behind the mics. And as you make your question rather than statement, indicate your name and organization. So the floor is open to all of you to come up, query this esteemed panel of experts.
I'll get things started. Hopefully more people will stand up and ask questions. This was an excellent panel. Really appreciate it. Obviously very timely, and appreciate the comments from you, Shannon, from a USG perspective. Very happy about the elevation of the DRG Center to the DRG Bureau and the additional influence that you have on inter and interagency discussions. One of the things that has been discussed quite a bit over the last several years, and that Tess talked about at the end, is closing political space. As we talk about electoral integrity and the quality of elections, Will made the point about the still value of international observers. There are also citizen observers, right? One of the things that wasn't talked much about was the pressure that they are under across the regions, and how that is the same or different. I note that the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders recently recognized election observers as a special kind of human rights defender, recognizing that the pressure that international and citizen observers are under to promote electoral integrity. How does this pushback against these tools that have been so effective in the 80s, the 90s, 2000s affect our ability to promote positive democratic change and credible elections in 2024 and beyond? Thank you.
All right, seeing no other questions at this time, let's go back to our panel. Shannon, would you like to speak to that first?
Well, first of all, thank you for the very stimulating discussion. Lots of ideas, and we're taking copious notes. So in terms of closing civic space or political space, that's why we can't see elections as an isolated event, because the die is cast in many cases so many months or even years in advance. So to give you an example, I was just in Sri Lanka. The day I was visiting the parliament, they passed this online safety bill, which everybody from a grassroots activist to young, savvy tech people who have their own consultancies were saying was going to put fear in people in terms of speaking out, expressing themselves, was meant to really dissuade people from mobilizing and engaging. And that is why we have to look at this comprehensively, and we have to use our policy muscle and influence, as well as our programs, to call attention to all of the things that are happening that are going to keep elections from being anything but free, fair, and competitive. On the issue of election monitors, I'm so glad you mentioned that. We absolutely have seen that. Election monitors directly being threatened and targeted and harassed. I think where that has happened, the US government has been a voice calling for backing off and really defending them and saying that they must be protected, as with other human rights defenders. And the last thing I'll say on that is, within the DRG Bureau, we are looking comprehensively at this priority of defending the defenders and really thinking about all of the various partners and civic actors who are being threatened, harassed, and targeted, and really making sure that the funds that we have and our capabilities and all of these rapid response mechanisms are not treating an election monitor differently than an anti-corruption activist, or different from a journalist, or different from an environmental activist, because they're all facing the same pressures. And we need to make sure that we have a holistic system of resources and assistance and support to, to defend them. So thank you for flagging that. It is absolutely on our radar screen. And one of the things that we're thinking about in addition to the assistance is just being really clear about what international principles call for when it comes to the defense of election monitors, both international and domestic.
I just want to add one thing to that, and it's just the Guatemala, kind of what we learned from Guatemala, because I was stressing the U.S. and international role, but I think what we saw in is that the civic space, the fact that it was still there and there was space for, in particular, the indigenous community, the youth, and also and they were able to come together, and there were also members of the private sector. I mean, I think we tend to think of the private sector as monolithic in parts of Central America, but there were actually members of the private sector that sat down with the indigenous organizations and the youth. So I think going forward, it's going to be really important that unity and that civil society, kind of that grouping stays together.
Please.
Hi, I'm Carl Levan from American University. And one of the facts that recently struck me a lot, or very powerfully in my research on democratic backsliding and work that I've done on democratization, is that the volume of global trade between democracies and non-democracies has grown, and authoritarian regimes now constitute almost half of the world's global GDP. And the reason why that struck me is because in the 1990s, when I was working in Congress, there was a lot of optimism that global economic integration would promote democratization. And so, on the one hand, I'm interested in how thinking about that has maybe evolved over that time, but I'm also really curious to know what sort of smart things the Treasury Department is doing to, in narrow ways, target authoritarian economic enabling behavior. 20 years ago, I met with one of the founders of Transparency International, and he said, I quit Transparency International because they were all hiding their money in the United States, and I couldn't get the United States to do anything about it. That has kind of changed, but I'm really curious to know, those two things, and noting the importance of innovations like the Bush administration's anti-kleptocracy initiative, for example.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. Let's take one more question. I'm sorry, sir. I think we're going to be out of time for yours, and then have the panel, as you see fit, respond to the two. So please.
Great. Hi, my name is Marcia, and I am the Research Evaluation and Learning Director for the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening. And my question goes back actually to your initial comments. You mentioned that this is a make or break year. And unfortunately, I think most of the storyline that we've heard from today's speakers suggests that we're not on a great trajectory. And so I'm wondering, what are the cases? Where are the cases where there's like that window of opportunity? How can we dig in our heels there? What are the characteristics of those cases that might be transferable to other contexts that we should be trying to leverage in this bumper year of elections? How can we actually turn the tide? And where are those spaces where we might be able to do that? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marcia. What I'd like to do is turn to the panelists. 5 of you, if you'd like to react to any of those questions, and I'll give Shannon the final word. So we have 2 questions, global trade, closing space. Yeah, Dan, please.
Very interesting observation about what's happening with trade and democracy. And it shows how good intentions are not enough to get the desired results. So the US government put, under W. Bush, put a lot of effort behind the idea of making China a responsible stakeholder of the international community. And the belief that if we include them in the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, if we treat them like a normal country, and if we make them rich, they will become more democratic. And it's easy to, be a Monday morning quarterback and say, They should have known it won't work. But it was a reasonable bet. It was a reasonable bet. But it's also part of something that General McMaster loves to call strategic narcissism, meaning we look at other people and say, but surely they want to be like us, don't they? We are free and prosperous and democracy, and surely everybody. No, they don't. I mean, Xi Jinping doesn't, you know. Okay, so it didn't work there. You also have the case of Angela Merkel, at one point celebrated as the true leader of the free world, if you remember. But now it turns out that the whole economic model that she had created for Germany collapsed. It was the Wandel durch Handel. We will trade with the Russians, and surely the Russians will be like the Germans. Why wouldn't they? And they will be, and that didn't work. And unfortunately, I think that the world is going to split in trading blocks because China is cheating in its trading and Russia is sanctioned, and Iran was sanctioned under Trump, was not under Biden, will be sanctioned again under Biden. And so trade is not going to become a tool to make the world more democratic. So that's the depressing part of my comment here, but I would like to end on a positive note. Please look at Europe as an example of democracy working. So right now, the right is ascending. Before, the left was ascending. At some point in the future, the left will ascending, or both are ascending, or the center is ascending. But democracy is alive and functioning very well, thank you very much, in Europe. So it may not work in other places, but it is working in Europe, the part. That's, yeah, thank you.
On the question on where can we turn the tide, I think it's a little hard to say for certain where that will be until the processes play out. But what I would say is this, and I think this connects a little bit to Carl's point, which is to say that on top of just showing up, you know, on the USG side diplomatically afterwards, I think more has to be done to sort of positively incentivize you know, some of this. And what I mean by this is trade agreements, you know, bring in private sector, demonstrate that like other benefits accrue to countries that you know, follow particular processes, right? Because I think if, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, what we can say pretty definitively over the last few years is like punitive hasn't worked. It's actually, I think, backfired. And so, you know, I think we have to be thinking creatively about what are those series of carrots as opposed to simply sticks. I'm not necessarily calling out the USG on this, but I'm more generally in terms of the broader international community. And I don't think anybody from Europe or here in the US has a great answer to you know, how quickly China can build freeways in sub-Saharan Africa. Very, very quickly. I highly doubt that's going to be possible for any country in the West to overcome that. So I think the question is like, what sorts of arrangements and partnerships and trade agreements, whatever, you know, things in that vein can be used to sort of show what moving down a particular path can mean in terms of economic recovery. So that would be my suggestion.
I'll try to keep this short and sweet. Your entry point about economic and trade tools, I'd like to make a pitch for, I don't think people who are present in this room, although I do love USAID, which is what about Treasury? What about USTR? What about Commerce? What about DOD? I think the democratic fight is not going to be won by USAID alone. I think USAID knows that. I don't want to speak for Shannon or others, but I think USAID knows it needs to be a whole of government effort. And that's where this falls apart, is because you can give as much assistance as you want and you can have diplomats go and wag their fingers or give incentives as much as you want. But if there's a DOD military training exercise, or if there's a trade agreement, or if there's anything like that, that is in contradiction to the pro-democracy sort of progress you want with a country, it doesn't work. And there are lots of creative tools. The anti-corruption strategy the USG released is brilliant. brilliant and has a lot of tools that are hard to use, right? So they fall to the bottom, focusing on beneficial ownership, focusing on following the money, on financial actions that are more creative than sanctions. So I just want to make a pitch for that. I'm not an expert myself, but would love to see some of them in this room and excited to come talk with elections nerds. And then as for the windows of opportunity, I would just say we're not going to see a lot of them in MENA, but the way you get windows of opportunity is by having people and activists across regions talk to one another. So I would really love to see us help facilitate that, including the MENA. Thank you.
Just a couple quick notes. I especially want to talk about China. When we look back we talk about how trade with China didn't work, how it didn't lead to democracy, how it didn't lead to freedom. I think a couple things. One, it's easy to go back and look, hindsight's 2020, but I think the intention was correct, and I think the thought process was correct. I think some of the details were wrong. To give you an example, I think the way that the United States allowed China to enter the WTO was a big mistake. The way that it happened was a mistake, not the fact that it happened. And so that's something we can always go back and look at. But the bar was much too low for China, and that has enabled them to continue to game the system up until today. But also, I think the jury's not out. We talk about like, oh, look, China did it. China's not rich. Like we look at their overall GDP, yeah, but they have 1.4 billion people. But the people generally are not rich. And so I think the jury is also not out on China and where economic development and where the opening and reform has actually gone. I also disagree with you on point that this is not what China wants. China does want to be like us. When I say China, I mean the people of China. Xi Jinping doesn't want that. And when I say be like us, I don't mean they want to live like Americans. What they want is what Taiwan has. And what Taiwan has is Chinese culture, freedom, democracy, all the good stuff. Prosperity, all of it. And so if China wants to become prosperous, which I know China does, it is through democracy. And so I think when we talk about what the US government can and should do, it's to remind people that there's basically three types of prosperous states in the world: city-states, petrostates, and democracies. And I think this is where a lot of times we kind of forget that it is democracy that ultimately provides prosperity. The Chinese love to hit on the fact that, look at our model, it's so much better. But once you start to dig in, it's actually not. And I think we need to be a little more foot forward in reminding everyone that that is not the case, that this is the best model for everybody.
An important point to the US that we need to invest even more in countering that narrative that the PRC is pushing. Okay, Shannon, over to you for the final word.
Well, that's great because all of these things give me an opportunity to toot the horn of the new DRG Bureau because we're working in all these areas. So first, the idea that there should be benefits that accrue when countries are taking democratic steps is exactly the logic behind the Democracy Delivers initiative as well as the Economic Resilience initiative. We are out there talking to the IMF about loan agreements for countries that are taking the right steps. We're out there hustling for deals that the DFC can execute on. We're out there like trying to get the private sector to take an interest in investing in countries that are moving in the right direction. So that is very much part and parcel of USAID's approach. On the hiding illicit and ill-gotten gains in the US, as Tess mentioned, a couple of years ago, the U.S. released the U.S. strategy on countering corruption. For the first time, it acknowledged that we are part of the problem because we are providing sanctuary for these stolen resources and committed us to try to expunge ill-gotten gains from our system. There has been a lot of progress, beneficial ownership registry, new rules on real estate, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we have made significant progress, as has Europe, which was in large part necessitated or forced by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when a lot of European countries realized that they have a poison or a cancer within their country, and that is these stolen resources. On the question of where there are sort of bright spots or things to be looking forward to, oftentimes you don't know until you know, right? So I was in Liberia a year ago. Everybody was absolutely despondent about the prospects of that election. And look what happened. Same with Guatemala. So sometimes you can really be surprised, right? And that's why we have to be there and we have to be agile. I would also mention that USAID has piloted a methodology for electoral assistance after action reviews, EA3, which is basically to learn what worked, what didn't, so that we can apply it to future lessons. And so we've done that in Nepal, and we'll be using that methodology in 2 more countries. And then finally, on this last note of narratives, we have invested a significant amount of resources really interrogating pro-authoritarian narratives and pro-democracy narratives, and find sometimes that we are our own worst enemy because we're hyping sort of the power and the salience of authoritarians and downplaying, I think, the resonance that democracy and freedom still very much have in people's lives. And so we are really trying to emphasize the qualities of democracy that do make it the best model, and remind ourselves to not get too desperate or to despair too much, because people around this world still long for democracy and are still willing to put it all on the line in this year of elections to achieve it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shannon, for those remarks, for joining us here today. Thanks again to our panel of experts, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.